The shack that won't let go. A death trap in the heart of the woods. On the outskirts of the small town of Hawkswood, surrounded by dense forests, a young couple, Jack and Emma, were preparing for a trip. They had long dreamed of spending a weekend away from the hustle and bustle, and the idea of renting an old cabin in the woods seemed like a great way to relax. "This place looks very secluded," Jack said, looking at the map. "A couple of miles off the highway, and not a soul around. It's exactly what we need." "Are you sure there'll be a connection?" Emma asked, fixing her brown hair. Sometimes it's good to take a break from the internet. Just nature, you and me." Jack winked at her. They loaded their stuff into the old pickup truck and hit the road. The road to the cabin was through dense forest, and the farther they got from the town, the darker the atmosphere became. The sun, hidden behind a dense canopy of trees, illuminated the way with rare glimmers of light. After an hour, they turned onto a narrow dirt road that seemed to lead deep into the dark forest. "It's so quiet here," Emma said, looking out the window at the tree trunks. "That's a good thing." "Quiet is rare," Jack answered, but his voice sounded less sure. Soon they saw the cabin. It looked as if it had been standing there for centuries. The roof was sagging slightly, and the windows were covered with dust and cobwebs. "Well, what do you think?" Jack asked, trying to hide the slight worry in his voice. "It's atmospheric," Emma replied, smiling wearily. The cabin didn't look hospitable, but they had no other choice. The nearest motel was dozens of miles away. The inside of the cabin smelled damp and dusty. The old wooden floors creaked underfoot, and the walls were decorated with faded photographs and strange drawings. "What an interior," Emma muttered, looking around the room. Jack set their things on the table and opened the refrigerator. It was empty except for a few old jars of unidentifiable canned goods. "I guess we'll have to make dinner ourselves," he joked. Emma walked over to the fireplace. There was a stack of books on the shelf, and an old, shabby diary stood out. "Look what I found," she said, handing it to Jack. They sat down on the couch and began to read. On the first few pages were notes from over a century ago. Someone named William Baines had written about his life in the cabin, how he'd settled here with his family, hoping to start a new life. But the writings soon grew darker and darker. William wrote of strange sounds he heard at night, of how his wife began to see figures in the woods. The entry followed, "I can't trust her anymore. She says the forest is calling to her, that it wants to take us away. But I feel it's a cabin. It lives, it breathes, it watches us." Emma laughed nervously. "Well, he certainly wasn't himself." "Maybe," Jack said, flipping the page. "But something about this place is really weird." The night took them by surprise. They lit the fireplace to keep warm and prepared a modest supper from the food they had brought with them. As they sat down at the table, the light from the candles and fire cast long shadows across the walls. "Have you noticed that there are no sounds at all in this forest?" Emma asked, breaking the silence. Jack listened. No birds, no rustling, no wind. Just the crackling of wood in the fireplace. "Maybe it's the time of year," he suggested, but the explanation did not reassure them. They went to bed, trying to ignore the oddities. In the night, however, Emma woke up. She was awakened by a rustle. She lay in the dark, listening. "Jack?" she whispered, but he was asleep. The rustling sounded again, closer this time. She glanced at the bedroom door and saw the gap between the sashes slowly widening. Emma clamped a hand over her mouth to keep from screaming. A click. The door opened completely. Emma was left lying motionless, her heart pounding frantically in her chest. She tried not to breathe too loudly, listening to the silence. A click. The doormat behind the door creaked softly. Emma gingerly reached out to Jack, trying to wake him up. Her fingers lightly nudged his shoulder. "Jack!" she whispered, barely audible. He wiggled but didn't wake up. Emma glanced at the door again. A dark figure stood on the threshold. It didn't move, but it seemed to be looking directly at her. At that moment, Jack sat up abruptly on the bed. "What's wrong?" he asked, still sleepy. Emma turned toward him, but when she glanced at the door again, the figure was gone. "Yeah, I saw someone," she breathed out. Jack, frowning, turned on the flashlight and pointed it at the door. There was no one behind it. "You're probably just dreaming about something," he tried to reassure her, but there was anxiety in his voice. "It wasn't a dream," Emma insisted. "I heard footsteps and saw a shadow." Jack sighed, got out of bed and checked the entire house. The doors were locked, the windows closed. "There's no one here, Em. Let's try to get some sleep. Okay?" She reluctantly agreed, but she couldn't go back to sleep. In the morning, they decided to deal with what had happened. Jack assured Emma that it could have been a play of light or shadow, but she insisted on examining the house more thoroughly. If it was just an old house, why was it so uncomfortable? She asked, opening one of the closets. The closet was filled with old things. Dusty blankets, boxes with unknown contents, and glass jars containing dried herbs. Jack, meanwhile, picked up the journal again. On the last page they had read, it was written, "She comes at night. I can't see her, but I know she's here. The forest has brought her to take us away." "Who is this she?" Jack asked aloud. Emma answered nothing. She found an old box, locked with a lock that someone had knocked off with an axe. Inside were old photographs. One of them depicted a man with empty eyes. His hands clutched the shoulders of a little girl who looked directly into the lens. Her face seemed too distorted, as if something had disturbed the film. "It's creepy," Emma mumbled, showing the picture to Jack. He scrutinized the picture and felt a chill run down his spine. "Maybe it's just a flaw in the picture," he suggested. But the longer they stared at the image, the more they felt that someone was watching them. That night they heard rustling again. This time it was coming from under the floor. "Jack, can you hear it?" Emma whispered. He nodded and picked up the flashlight. They went down into the living room. The creaking of the floorboards was getting louder, as if someone was walking right underneath them. "This must be the old basement," Jack said. They found a trapdoor in the floor that was covered by a rug. With difficulty they opened it and found a staircase leading down into absolute darkness. "Are you sure this is a good idea?" Emma asked, trembling with fear. "We need to figure out what those sounds are," replied Jack. As they descended, they saw that the basement was filled with strange objects. Candles scorched to the ground, a bloody knife, and a large mirror covered in dust. There were strange symbols carved into the walls. They didn't look like anything familiar. "This is some kind of ritual place," Emma said, feeling the coldness stiffen her body. At that moment, the mirror shook slightly, as if something was moving in it. "Jack, we have to get out of here now," she shouted. But just as they turned around, the hatch slammed shut. The darkness became absolute. "Do you hear that?" Jack whispered, trying to make out something in the darkness. Emma froze. Muffled voices came from deep down in the basement. They sounded like whispers, but it was impossible to make out the words. "Who's there?" Jack asked loudly, pointing his flashlight in the direction of the sounds. The flashlight flickered and went out. "Shit!" he cursed, frantically pressing the button. Emma felt someone's cold fingers touch her shoulder. She screamed, turning around, but saw no one. Suddenly the voices intensified, turning into a loud whisper that came from all directions. "They've come. Stay. The hut has been waiting for you." The voices grew louder and louder. They seemed to sound right inside their heads. Emma clutched at Jack's arm, her breathing hitching. "Jack, we have to get out," she shouted, barely able to hear the whispers. "Where's the hatch?" Jack fumbled for the wall with his hands, but the door leading upstairs seemed to disappear. Suddenly silence hit like a deafening wave. The voices disappeared as suddenly as they had appeared. The basement plunged into an ominous, ringing silence. Jack lit the lantern, which suddenly came back on. Its faint light brought out the mirror from the darkness. It no longer reflected them. Instead, the glass showed a picture of the forest, the same forest that surrounded the cabin. "Can you see it?" Emma whispered, pointing at the mirror. Jack stepped closer, and suddenly the surface of the mirror moved like water splashed with a stone. A voice came out of it, deep, hoarse, and old. "You shouldn't have come here. You're mine now." Emma screamed and stepped back, but suddenly the mirror swallowed up the lantern light. Darkness covered them head to toe. When they came to, they found themselves back in the living room of the cabin. The fireplace was no longer burning and the room was shrouded in cold. What was this? Was it a dream? Emma whispered, shivering with fear. No, Jack answered, breathing heavily. It was something real. On the table where the diary had been, there were now clippings of old newspapers. Jack slowly walked over and picked up one of them. The headline screamed, "Family vanished without a trace. Cabin on forest's edge cursed." "It's about them," he said, showing the article to Emma. "About the family that lived here before us." The article was about the Baines family, who had moved into the cabin in 1898. After a few months, neighbors began to notice strange things. Children disappearing, strange noises coming from the woods. Soon the family itself disappeared without a trace, leaving the house empty. "Do you think this place has something to do with what happened to them?" Emma asked. "It's not just a cabin," said Jack, pointing to another clipping. "Look at this." On the clipping was a map of the forest, labeled Ritual Zone. "Do not enter." That's not a coincidence. The basement, the symbols, the mirror. This place was used for something bad. That night, they hardly slept at all. The hut seemed to breathe. Every movement was accompanied by the creaking of floorboards, rustling behind the walls that could no longer be attributed to the old age of the house. In the middle of the night, Emma heard Jack get out of bed. "Where are you going?" she whispered. "Yeah, I heard something outside," he replied, grabbing a flashlight. "Don't go alone." The two of them stepped out onto the porch. The sky was black, the stars hidden behind clouds. The air was heavy, as if it were a thunderstorm. "Did you hear that?" Emma asked. A long groan came from the forest. It wasn't the sound of wind or an animal cry. It was a voice. Jack pointed his flashlight in the direction of the sound. At the edge of the woods stood a figure. It was a woman, her long hair hanging in messy strands and her face covered by a thick shadow. "Who is it?" Emma whispered. "Probably a local. Maybe she can help," Jack said uncertainly. He took a step forward, but Emma grabbed his arm. "No, Jack, don't." The woman raised her head, and her eyes glowed red. She opened her mouth, but instead of words, a deafening scream escaped from her throat, causing them to rush back into the house in a panic. "It's the creature from the forest," Emma said, trembling as they locked the door. "It doesn't want us to leave." "But why?" Jack searched desperately for an explanation. "Remember what the diary said? The cabin won't let go. We're part of it now." Jack pulled a map out of the newspaper. "If it's a ritual zone, there might be a way to stop it there." Emma reluctantly agreed. They packed their things, armed with flashlights and a knife they had found in the basement. Their path lay through the dark forest. The sounds around them came alive. Rustles, voices, strange footsteps that followed them but never came closer. Finally, they reached the place marked on the map. It was an old stone platform surrounded by a circle of scorched earth. In the center stood a wooden cross, all covered in the same symbols as in the basement. "What now?" Emma asked. "I think it's the source of everything. If we destroy it, we might be able to get away." Jack started a fire and threw the gasoline they brought with them on the cross. But as the flames engulfed the wooden structure, the forest came alive. Voices turned into screams, the trees stirred, and figures began to emerge from the darkness, the same figures that had been in the pictures in the cabin. "You're not leaving!" The screams grew louder and louder, the figures surrounding them. But the fire continued to devour the cross. Emma felt something grab her arm. She screamed, but Jack managed to wrestle it away with his knife. As the cross burned completely, the forest fell into absolute silence. The figures disappeared and the air became lighter. "Did we make it?" Emma asked, hardly believing what was happening. "Yes," Jack exhaled, but his voice shook. They ran back to the cabin, packed their things, and left without looking back. As they drove out of the woods that morning, Emma looked in the car mirror and gasped. In the reflection, she saw the same woman with the burning eyes who now sat in the back seat. This isn't over. Emma turned sharply to the back seat, but no one was there. What happened? Jack asked, keeping his eyes on the road. She was here? Emma barely spoke, feeling the fear gripping her again. Who was she? The woman from the forest, Emma whispered. She was in the mirror. Jack gripped the steering wheel so hard his knuckles turned white. We're out of the damn woods. It's just your nerves, he said, trying to convince not only her, but himself. But Emma didn't believe it was over. She felt something tugging at them, as if an invisible thread was connecting them to the cabin and what had happened. When they reached the nearest motel, Emma insisted they stay at least one night. I can't drive anymore, Jack. I need to rest. Okay, but we're going home tomorrow. They rented a small room. Emma took a shower, hoping to wash away the feeling of terror, but even the hot water couldn't warm her up. When she came out of the bathroom, Jack was sitting on the bed, staring at something in his hands. What is it? She asked, coming closer. This is from the cabin, he answered, showing a small wooden amulet shaped like a circle that was covered with strange symbols. It was in my pocket. Emma felt her heart skip a beat. Did you take it with you? I don't remember how it got there, Jack said, his voice shaking. We have to get rid of it. It has something to do with what's going on. But before they could do anything, the light in the room flickered. The figure of a woman appeared in the mirror opposite the bed. She stood motionless, looking at them with her burning eyes. You won't be able to leave, she whispered. Jack grabbed the amulet and ran out of the room, intending to throw it away. Emma ran after him. What are you going to do? She shouted. Burn it. We have to destroy it. They found a metal trash can outside the motel, threw the amulet inside, and lit it with a lighter. The flames engulfed the amulet, and in that moment, the world shook. The air was filled with a muffled, low sound, like a distant moan. The ground shook underfoot, and all the windows in the motel shattered at once. But when the amulet turned to ash, it was suddenly quiet. Is it over? Emma asked, afraid to believe it. Jack didn't answer. He stared at the urn where the remains of the amulet lay, his face pale. Emma, he whispered, pointing to the ashes. The symbols that had been on the amulet began to show through right on the surface of the urn, as if scorched by fire. It was a mistake, Jack muttered. The sound of footsteps came from the darkness behind them. They turned and saw the same woman, but she looked different now, her body even more distorted and her eyes brighter. You've done what I wanted. You are mine now. They ran without looking back. The forest began to come alive around them again, even though they were far away from the hut. We can't get away from her, Emma shouted. We have to try, Jack shouted, grabbing her hand. But the farther they ran, the more the world around them turned into that very forest. The motel disappeared, the road dissolved, and they found themselves in front of the cabin again. No! Emma screamed, falling to her knees. We're gone. We got out. Jack stared at the cabin in silence. It looked just as it had the first day they'd arrived. The windows were covered in dust and the doors were slightly ajar, as if inviting them in. The woman was no longer following them, but they could feel her presence. It was in the air, in the trees, in the cabin itself. We can't leave. This place is a trap, Jack said. Emma began to cry. But why? Why us? It doesn't matter, he replied, slowly heading towards the cabin. We are hers now. A few weeks passed. The locals of Hawkswood began to whisper again about the strange sounds coming from the forest. A couple of hikers who decided to spend the day outdoors came across an old cabin. Are you sure it's safe? The girl asked, looking around the house. Come on, it's just an old cabin. No one's been here for ages, her boyfriend said, pushing the door open. It creaked open, and the silence of the forest seemed suddenly frighteningly loud. But there was a surprise waiting for them inside. On the floor lay an old diary, open at the first page, where someone had written in large letters, "Don't come in. Leave while you can." From the darkness of the corner, Two burning eyes watched them. The shack had found new guests. Alternate grim ending. When Jack and Emma realized they were back at the cabin, something inside them broke. "It's over," Emma whispered, struggling to catch her breath. Jack didn't answer anything. He was looking at the cabin, which now looked almost alive. The windows seemed to glow from within, and a low, deep whisper came from the door. They walked slowly inside, as if they were being led by some unknown force. The hut no longer looked abandoned. The walls were clean, the floors were shining, and a fire burned in the fireplace. Dinner was waiting for them on the table, 2 dishes, smoking plates and wine glasses. "What is this?" Emma whispered, hesitating to move closer. "It's a trap," Jack muttered, but his eyes were clouded, as if his consciousness no longer belonged to him. He sat down at the table, as if against his will, and gestured for Emma to join him. She trembled, but couldn't resist. As they sat down, the cabin door slammed shut with a deafening rumble. The room was instantly plunged into darkness. "Thank you for coming back," came the same voice. A woman stepped out of the shadows, but she no longer looked human. Her body seemed woven from shadows, and her eyes were 2 red coals. "You are now part of this place," she said. "Your souls will nourish the hut, just like all the others." Jack tried to stand up, but his body felt as if it had become attached to the chair. Emma screamed, but her voice had no power. The woman held out her hand, and everything in the room began to distort. The walls of the hut turned into living, pulsing surfaces. The symbols they had seen before glowed on every plank. The air became viscous and seemed to draw the life out of them. "Did you think you could escape?" The woman's voice echoed through the room. But no one was leaving. Emma saw Jack close his eyes. His face contorted in pain, and he seemed to vanish into thin air, leaving only a faint cloud of ash behind him. "No, Jack!" Emma screamed, but her body wouldn't listen anymore. She felt the darkness begin to consume her. The last thing she saw was her own reflected silhouette in the cabin window. The face of the woman with the red eyes gradually overlapped with her own until they became one. Years passed. The forest once again attracted the curious. This time, a group of students decided to investigate the cabin after rumors of missing tourists. When they entered, they were greeted by a well-kept room with a blazing fireplace. "Does someone live here?" one of the students asked. A woman came out of the corner. She was young, with a soft smile on her face. "Welcome," she said. "You must be hungry." The students sat down at the table, unaware that they were becoming part of an endless cycle. The forest is always finding new souls for its hut. The hut is not just a trap. She is an eternal hunger that will never be satiated. Story 2. Cabin in the Woods. The Curse of the Browland Forest. The Browland Forest in the south of France was famous for its legends. It was believed that an old witch's hut was hidden here, shunned even by hunters. Those who ventured in never returned. Sebastian and Laura, a couple from Paris, decided to spend a weekend in this region, enjoying nature and history. A guidebook they found at a gas station mentioned mysterious trails and abandoned villages. But no warning about the Browland Forest was in it. "Let's turn here," Sebastian suggested when he saw a path that led deep into the forest. "There's nothing here," said Laura, looking at the map. "Let's check it out." The path was longer than they had expected. The sunny day turned into a dark, cold evening. Laura began to feel nervous, but Sebastian assured her that everything was under control. Finally, an old hut appeared behind the dense trees. It was made of stone, with a drooping roof and a shabby wooden door. At first glance, it looked like an ordinary abandoned building, but something was wrong with it. "We can sleep here," Sebastian suggested, pushing the door open. Inside was one large room with a fireplace, an old table, a bed, and a chest. But what caught Laura's eye most was the mirror on the wall. Its cracks looked strange, as if they formed an intricate pattern. "This place looks like a museum of ancient horror," Laura muttered. While Sebastian explored the chest, Laura walked over to the mirror. She noticed that her reflection was unnatural. It was as if it lagged a little behind her movements. "Sebastian, can you see it? Wait, look what I found," he interrupted, holding up an old leather diary. On the first few pages were entries in French from the 17th century. "My family hid in this forest to escape death in the village. But here we found not salvation, but something worse. The forest comes alive at night. If you're reading this, run and don't look back." "Nonsense," Sebastian said, but Laura felt a chill run down her back. In the night, Laura awoke to a strange sound. It sounded like someone scraping against the stone walls of the hut. Sebastian was asleep, but Laura decided to wake him. "Do you hear that? It's just branches," he mumbled, turning over on his other side. But Laura went to the window and saw something strange. On one of the trees opposite the house appeared a carved rune that glowed with a faint green light. "Sebastian, get up." He walked over to the window and frowned. "Someone's joking. We'll check it out tomorrow." The next day they decided to explore the forest. The path they had come on had disappeared, and more glowing runes appeared on the trees. When they returned to the hut, they noticed that the mirror had changed. Now not only they could see in it, but also something behind their backs. They were strange figures that moved even though no one was in the room. "We have to leave," Laura said. "And how are we going to do it without a road?" At that moment, the mirror crackled, and black tentacles burst from it and wrapped themselves around Laura. Sebastian managed to grab her arm and pull her away, but the tentacles disappeared as suddenly as they had appeared. During the night, the forest came alive. The windows of the hut were flooded with dim green light, and the whispers became deafening. Sebastian decided to break the mirror, thinking it was the source of their problems. He struck the glass with a rock, and the mirror shattered into shards. But instead of release, the same black tentacles emerged from the cracks and began to grip the hut like giant tree roots. A woman with long gray hair and burning eyes emerged from the corner of the room. "You have awakened the forest," she whispered. "You belong to it now." Sebastian tried to lunge at her, but her gaze paralyzed him. Laura screamed, but her voice could not drown out the deafening noise that filled the cabin. Sebastian began to be swallowed up by the shadows. His body was disappearing, turning into black smoke. Laura tried to run, but the door of the hut was locked. "You'll be next," the woman said, and her figure began to dissolve. Laura ran to the window, but saw her reflection. There was a stranger's face, a distorted face with burning eyes. The last thing she heard was her own scream. The police found only their car left at the edge of the woods. No one found the hut, and the village began to whisper again about the ancient curse. Some tourists who passed by said that they heard strange whispers in the forest and saw glowing runes on the trees. The hut continued to wait for new guests. A year after Sebastian and Laura disappeared, 3 friends, Marie, Julian, and Antoine, hiked through the Browlant forest. They had heard of the curse, but treated the stories as village superstition. "It's just a legend to scare tourists," Antoine said as they started the fire. "Then why do so few people come here?" Marie asked, looking around. "Because they are afraid of fairy tales," Julian grinned. On the second day of their journey, they discovered a strange trail that wasn't on the map. Marie insisted that they stay on it, but Julian and Antoine's curiosity got the better of them. "It's only a couple of kilometers. If there's nothing there, we'll go back," Antoine said. The path led them to a hut. It looked abandoned, but it was strangely attractive. "Well, it's just an old house," Julian said. "Why don't we spend the night here?" Marie felt uncomfortable. An inexplicable sense of unease swept over her, but she didn't argue. Inside, the hut looked almost untouched. Old paintings hung on the walls, the furniture was covered in dust, and a broken shard of mirror lay on the mantel. Marie picked it up and saw in the reflection a face that was not her own. It belonged to a young woman with an expression distorted by fear. She threw the shard away fearfully. "There's something wrong here," she said, but Antoine and Julian laughed. Meanwhile, Julian had found a trunk that contained Sebastian's diary. "Listen to this." He began to read. "We shouldn't have come in here. This place is alive. is consuming us. If anyone finds this diary, run." His voice was interrupted by a loud creak, and the door of the hut slammed shut on its own. "It's the wind," Antoine said, trying not to show his fear. But the windows began to darken, as if night had fallen outside, though the time was still daylight. Soon they began to hear whispering. It came from the walls, the floor, even from the fireplace. Marie looked at the mirror again, and this time she saw 3 people, a man and a woman, screaming out of the darkness and herself. "We have to get away," she shouted, grabbing Julian's arm. But the door wouldn't budge, and the whispering grew louder, turning into a low, menacing roar. Glowing runes began to appear on the floor, the same ones Laura had seen a year ago. "What is that?" Antoine shouted, but suddenly the walls of the hut began to move, as if transformed into living flesh. Shadows crawled out of the fireplace and took the form of the same woman with gray hair. "Welcome home," she whispered. Julian tried to grab a stone and throw it at the woman, but she only laughed. "You're not the one in control of the place," she said. The shadows squeezed him, pulling him into the floor. His scream was cut off abruptly. Marie and Antoine ran to the window, but now it looked like a solid black surface. "We're not getting out," Marie whispered. Antoine tried in desperation to break down the door, but the hut had already finally come to life. Its walls were moving, the cracks in the floor widening into an abyss. Marie felt her feet begin to fall through. Antoine tried to hold her up, but soon the same fate befell him. When everything quieted down, the cabin looked like an abandoned house again. A new mirror hung on the wall, which now showed the faces of Marie, Julian, and Antoine frozen in terror. The Browlant forest was quiet again, waiting for new guests. The forest lives as long as its victims live. A few months after the disappearance of the 3 hikers, new footprints appeared in the Browlant forest, on the outskirts of the village where the same trail began. They were the tracks of another group who, like all others before them, had not returned. Meanwhile, there was disturbing news in Paris as a young woman named Julie, the sister of one of the missing, began to investigate. She didn't believe that her brother had simply disappeared without a trace. She had heard rumors about the Browlant forest, but she couldn't believe them. Julie decided that she would go to the forest herself to find out what had happened to her brother. She was determined to find some clues, even if she had to face something no one could describe in words. Julie traveled to the village where she met locals who were reluctant to share information. They said that the hut was not just an old building, but a place of power that attracted misfortune. Anyone who tried to look in there would disappear. No one knew what was going on inside, but it was said that the hut chooses those who shouldn't be here. Julie was determined, and despite the threatening stories, she decided to walk the whole way herself. When she reached the hut, she was overcome by a feeling she could not explain. The forest around her had become strangely dark, as if day and night had mingled. There were no birds or animals on the path, and every step deep into the forest sounded echoing, as if the earth itself was absorbing the sound. Finally, she saw the cabin. At first glance, nothing had changed: the same shabby roof, the same moss-covered walls. But as she drew closer, something changed in the air. She felt her heart beat faster. Entering the cabin, Julie found the same old diary that Sebastian and Laura had once found. In its pages, she noticed a few new entries made, she thought, recently. "The shadows won't let go. We are here forever. If anyone reads this, don't try to figure out what's going on. Leave." It was a final warning. But Julie was not frightened. She continued to explore the house until she reached the very mirror. When she looked into his reflection, at first nothing happened. But then she saw a strange figure, a girl with dark eyes and a white, lifeless face standing behind her. Julie instantly turned around, but there was no one there. Then her gaze fell on the mirror again. Now the reflection was distorted. The shadows in it began to move and the figures grew brighter. The mirror began to draw her gaze, and a face appeared in its depths. The same face she had seen in the photographs of her missing relatives. Julie felt her legs grow heavy. Her whole body was filled with unbearable fear. She tried to move away, but she couldn't. The hut seemed to shrink around her. The dark figures in the mirror began to approach. Julie realized they were not just reflections, but something much more sinister. She felt a chill crawl into her soul. Every movement seemed to slow and her thoughts seemed so distant, as if she were on the edge between worlds. She took one last desperate step backward, breaking free of the mirror's hypnotic influence. But when she found herself at the door, she heard that same whisper again. That voice seemed to come from the forest itself. "You're not leaving," it said, and the door slammed shut in her face. Julie tried to get out again, but the cabin wouldn't let her go. Something changed inside her. She felt her own essence begin to dissolve into this place, becoming part of it. Her body was no longer her own. Dark silhouettes appeared around her, so familiar, but now they were her own reflections. When the locals found the cabin a few weeks later, they found it gone. Where the house had once stood was now just an empty plot of land, surrounded by a ring of old trees, with a growing sense of danger in the air. Only a few hazy reflections in the last mirror that now hung on the tree were reminders of what had once been here. Among them, a few new faces could be discerned: Julie, her brother, and others who were trying to understand the mystery of the Browland Forest. The hut continued to wait for new victims willing to reveal its secrets, and the forest continued to swallow those who dared to enter. Everything remained in this vicious cycle. A few more years passed, and the forest around the vanished hut became even more sinister. The strange disappearances continued, but now the locals preferred not to discuss them aloud. The curse of the forest was known to everyone, but no one wanted to attract the attention of sinister forces. But everything changed when a group of young people decided to unravel the secret of the Browland Forest and set out on an expedition. And Jean-Pierre, Louis, and Claire were anthropology and history students from Paris. They had heard about strange occurrences in the Browland Forest, about disappeared tourists and forgotten ancient curses. The group decided to check out what was really lurking in this forest. For them, this wasn't just an expedition. It was a chance to get into history, to uncover secrets that have been on the minds of scientists for centuries. As they approached the forest, the fog was already crawling over the ground. It was a strange feeling, as if everything alive was frozen in anticipation of something terrible. Louis, usually brave and confident, even began to doubt. But Anna reassured him that if anything happened, they could come back. "We can't just turn around and leave," she said, clutching the map. "We've come for knowledge." As they walked a few kilometers, the forest became increasingly dark and gloomy. No bird sounds or wind rustling could be heard. Only their footsteps broke the strange silence. As expected, they soon came upon a hut. It looked even more gloomy this time, with a ruined roof, cobwebbed windows, and a doorway completely closed. But something strange caught their attention. Outside the window, in the dilapidated frame, they saw a faint flicker of light. It was coming from some object inside the hut. When they entered, the air in the room was heavy, as if it were soaked with time and suffering. On the floor lay the very same diary. Anna picked it up and began to read it aloud. "Nothing is forgotten in this place. The forests demand their payment. Once you meet those who have already become part of this place, you cannot leave. Leaving is only for those who are willing to give up themselves." They all felt a chill run down their skin. "We can't leave here," Claire uttered, but her voice was muffled and fearful. But it was too late. A cracking sound was heard, as if something was breaking through from deep within the earth. Suddenly, shadows began to appear in the mirror hanging on the wall, not just reflections, but real, living images. The shadows became dense and dark, and they began to stretch out, joining with others. They slowly took on human shapes, those who no longer returned from this forest. At first they were faint silhouettes, then they became clearer and more ominous. Jean-Pierre cried out when one of the shadows touched his shoulder. His body instantly froze and his eyes filled with terror. Louis and Claire tried to break free, but a huge figure that looked like the woman who was already in the other mirror appeared in front of them. "You're not getting out," she whispered. "You're already here forever." Anna felt her strength leaving her. She couldn't move from her seat. Her body felt alien. The hut began to shrink around them. The walls moved and the light in the mirror grew brighter and brighter, consuming the space. Anna tried to find a way out, but the closer she got to the door, the more the space around her distorted. She couldn't believe that everything she saw and felt was real. This was more than just a house or a forest. This was a place where people were becoming part of something far more ancient and terrifying. When the group was finally absorbed into this world, their bodies were gone, but they had become part of whatever lived in the forest. Now their reflections, the same as those who came before them, froze in the mirror. Those who dared to enter became an integral part of the cursed place, forever lost and forgotten. Since that time, new explorers, tourists, and even casual passers-by have often lost track of the place. And the brilliant forest continued to live on. Each new reflection in the mirror is not just a memory of the past, but a new victim, part of an ancient curse that haunts those who dare to look into its dark depths. It had been 2 years since the brilliant forest had swallowed up a group of explorers. The locals continued to live in fear, avoiding these dangerous territories, but rumors of the forest's curse began to attract the attention not only of tourists, but also of scientists eager to unravel the mystery behind the disappearances. One of them was Dr. Louis Taver, a historian and archaeologist who decided to lead an expedition into the brilliant forest to find answers. He didn't believe in supernatural phenomena, but tales of the cabin and its frightening history caught his attention. Unlike his predecessors, Louis had no intention of giving in to panic. He intended to study the forest scientifically. Dr. Taver began his journey by analyzing ancient maps and archives. His research led to the discovery of an incredible mystery. The cabin, as it turned out, was not just a forgotten building, but had once been part of an ancient ritual associated with forest spirit cults. These cults worshipped something dark and uncharted that was hidden in the depths of the brilliant forest. Tavarus began preparing his expedition despite the warnings of the locals. He believed that the curses were simply an attempt to explain something inexplicable, and that the mystery of the disappearing men could be explained by other factors. He assembled a team of 3: Maria, an expert on ancient texts, Jeremy, a young explorer, and Laurent, an experienced forester. They were determined to go through the forest and find the answers that had remained hidden for so long. But as soon as they delved deeper into the forest, a strange series of events began. Laurent, an experienced guide, noticed strange footprints leading to the very place they were looking for. As they approached the hut, they felt the same chill that all the previous explorers had felt. The hut seemed almost alive, as if it was waiting for them. This place seemed out of place with reality. The hut looked as if it had been transported from another time, its walls covered in runes and signs that none of them could decipher. Maria examined the runes carefully, finding that they resembled ancient magical symbols used in forgotten rituals to seal souls. She said, "These marks are not just decorative. They hold something that shouldn't be here." Jeremy, despite his growing unease, offered to look around the inside of the hut. As soon as they entered, they felt the air thicken around them. Everything inside seemed unnatural: the dark mirror, the same old records the previous explorers had found. But this time they noticed something more. Footprints leading from the mirror to the floor, where a hidden staircase was concealed. The staircase led down to a dungeon no one knew about. As they descended, an eerie scene opened up before them. It wasn't just a place, it was a space, as if cut into the very fabric of the world. Time did not exist here, and the walls were covered with a fog in which they could distinguish human-like figures, but they were not alive. Tavarus was the first to realize that these were not just ancient rituals, but a portal. This forest was part of some other world, a world where death and life were intertwined. The souls of those who had died in these places were sealed here, like creatures living in anticipation of the next victim. "We have entered their world," Jeremy whispered. As he took a step forward, the walls of the dungeon came alive. Shadows began to move, and figures familiar to all began to emerge from the fog. Disappeared explorers, tourists, even those who had once visited the area and left their footprints. These were their souls sealed forever. "We can't get out," Maria said, realizing the terrible truth. We too have become part of this place. Suddenly, one of the shadows approached and spoke in a voice familiar to Tavros. It was the voice of his wife, whom he had lost many years ago. She said, "You were looking for answers, but you have become part of the question." He couldn't believe his ears, but when he looked into the figure's eyes, he realized it wasn't just her reflection. It was her soul sealed in this place. She was as much a part of the cursed forest as anyone else who dared to seek answers. Dr. Tavros realized that his actions had brought them here, and now they were all part of the forest. Their souls would await the next traveler who dared to enter the brilliant forest. Now, years later, the Browland Forest continues its dark life. The people who still take risks and try to unravel its mysteries disappear without a trace. Those who once dared to enter this world now become part of it. Reflections and mirrors, souls bound to this place, waiting for the next victim. A modest wooden sign at the entrance to the forest now warns. Here is not just a forest. Here is frozen time. Here is a world where the dead live among us. Do you enter to find answers, or to become part of the darkness?